All right, thanks, folks. Appreciate the opportunity to have a meal with you, and don't want to discourage the conversation, but would want to get going with the program here as well. Just a reminder again out in the lobby, if you would, our High School Business Challenge silent auction. Rick Edwards, the president of our foundation, would really appreciate if you would go ahead and bid on some of those items. Don't forget the raffle tickets as well. For some great getaways also. Again, as we say, backed by popular demand, because the four of us wanted to do it, I guess. That makes it popular. Going back to the format we've had in the past, where just kind of an overview of the perspective of the state of Montana business from the leadership of the Montana Chamber, me as the president and CEO, and then joined by these folks here. You've got the bios in the program that you picked up, this little guy, if you have that, but I'll just kind of summarize a little bit. Jeff Billman is the immediate past chair of the board of the Montana Chamber. Suffice to say, he's just a successful family business person and all-around good guy. So happy to have Jeff sitting today on this panel, but also in the service in the past. So Jeff, we appreciate that and thank you. Amy Grimals is the current chair of the board, and again, her bio is included in the program, but beyond that, I'll tell you that we've never been so energized in the chamber as we have been with Amy. Amy's efforts to develop our strategic plan is going to have benefit to the chamber for a long time to come, so we appreciate her involvement and her energy in that. Todd O'Hare is the vice president of programs and the incoming chair of the Montana Chamber as well. And looking down the road, it just struck me, I'm the oldest guy up here. Dee Durand, who was the office manager for the Montana Chamber for years, said you always know when you're getting old when the president, your boss, and your doctor are younger than you are, and I've got 3 out of 3. So actually, rather than saying I'm getting old, I think the Montana Chamber is getting young. So I like that, and we greatly appreciate young folks stepping up to the task as well. With this diversity, we've got, I think, pretty good representation of Montana as a whole. We've got a rural highline retailer with Jeff. We've got a multiple location law firm and lobbyist for various industries, and an energy producer as well. So I think what we're going to do, I'll lead off with just kind of an overall overview, I guess, of looking back into 2015. I'll start off actually kind of globally and look a little bit on the federal side, and then Montana as a whole. And then I'll hit a couple of specific industries, tourism and manufacturing. And then each one of these folks will look back at 2015 as well from their perspective, not only their industry and their business, but the geography as well. Jeff will hit retail, the kind of the rural perspective and rural Main Street, maybe even a little Canadian perspective, eh? And then Amy, with her lobbying experience, is going to focus a bit on the financial and the healthcare industries. And then Todd can talk about natural resources, including ag as well. And then after we look back at 2015, we'll dust off the crystal ball a little bit for our projections for the coming year. It might even do a little political projections. We'll see what time we have at the end. But when we look back at 2015, it obviously is another year of recovery for America and for Montana as a whole as well. I can't say the same necessarily about the global perspective. We have seen certainly some slowdowns around the world. The China juggernaut that it used to be has slowed down a bit. Now people say, well, yeah, but it's still doing better economy than a lot of the countries around the world, and that's true. We've seen the BRICS nations, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and if you want to throw South Africa in there, have certainly been slowing and suffering more so than they have in the past years. But that's obviously affecting Montana because a lot of our products go outside of our borders, and not just outside of the U.S. borders, or outside of Montana's borders, but the U.S. As well. So that's obviously impacted what we're doing in this state. On the federal side, we are at least seeing continued recovery from the Great Recession. Someone noted the other day, said, the recovery period since it started, 5.5 years ago now, I guess, actually that's kind of a normal time frame for when you see another recession or another correction, and that's odd to think about, because I don't think we really have recovered completely in that time frame. And yet, you know, the recession was so deep beyond just a flat-out depression. It was a significant hole to dig back out of. And as noted in a minute, maybe that's even a little bit in Montana too. There are still some tough spots in the state. But I think we do have some very good spots when we look at the federal level. I serve on the National Association of Manufacturers Board of Directors now, and NAM, because we are the state affiliate, we are the Manufacturing Association for Montana as well as the state chamber. NAM has been doing a great job in looking at what we need to do to rebuild the manufacturing base in America. And obviously that applies to us here in Montana as well. But there were some very good things that got passed later in the year. We heard from our delegation earlier, and everybody likes to point out some pluses and minuses. But I think we made some significant gains, especially in the latter half of the year, it seems. Export-Import Bank reauthorization, which was incredibly important for Montana. Some small businesses here rely heavily on that, and we'd like to see that reauthorized and got that passed, as well as, I think it was mentioned in one of the videos too, a 5-year reauthorization infrastructure funding. It's something in the past, it seemed like we weren't going to be able to hope for anything like that, maybe get a year at a time, or even I think at one point we had a 3-month reauthorization as well. To get 5 years is great. There was a bit of a concern, as was noted also from Senator Chester, with the debt increase, and I want to come back to that at the very end because I think that's an important topic as we look forward, where we are with this nation's debt and the deficits as well. But overall, tourism numbers across America were good, and when we switch instead and look a little bit at Montana, we saw Glacier National Park setting a record for attendance this past year. And then, I may have heard this morning, I know National Public Radio, or Montana Public Radio, had the report that Yellowstone is reporting breaking their records. In fact, I think it actually was broken back in November, an annual visitation record, and it's like something like 16% over the prior record. Just an incredible number. Kathy and I were fortunate to host what's called the Council of State Manufacturing Associations in Big Sky this summer. They pick one location each year, and it had picked Montana. So here we are, you know, in July, beautiful time of year in Montana. We had everybody come in early. We loaded up a bus, took them through Yellowstone Park, saw the buffalo swimming in the river, and saw wolf kill, and all of the things that people just, you know, they were agog about. Went through the next day. We actually had meetings, and we were planning on doing a big, you know, barbecue outside, and it just got colder and colder, and it snowed on July 27th. You wouldn't believe the folks from Alabama and Georgia snapping pictures and sending it back home, saying, "You're not gonna believe this," but we got snow. And the next day, back to 65, 70 degrees. We were golfing, so it crazy. But I told them, I said, "We're going to show you all 4 seasons in Montana," and by God, we did. So didn't even have to go to the top of the mountain. But the tourism numbers, I don't think that was why we broke the Yellowstone numbers. That was only 30 people, but we had very good visitation in Montana. And I think that's one of the bright spots that we've seen in our economy overall. I would, before I leave the federal issues, and I know Todd and maybe Amy, Jeff, all will talk a little bit about this, but we talk about the level of regulation, and that was also mentioned in one of the videos. And you know, we really are, it seems like, almost drowning in a sea of regulations. One of the reports that came out from the Congressional Oversight Committee, over 3,000 regulations passed last year. 3,000 regulations. We get a report from Capitol Hill. The Hill magazine is what it's called. And every day they say how many regulations and go through what they are that are going to be passed or put into the Federal Register. Notice of people being able to go to hearings and provide comment, that sort of thing. And it's usually over 100 a day during work days throughout the year, obviously when Congress is in session. How do you keep up with that? How do you manage your business? How do you plan for the future when you got that kind of a workload? I mean, we try to do that, Glenn here and I, and other volunteers in the chamber try to do that for you at the state level, try to stay on top of the regulations and new laws that are enacted and all the rest. But when we look at that level at the national, and it doesn't look like it's going to change for the coming year either, talk about that when we look ahead, but a lot more regulations, a lot more issues that you have to deal with during the year, including, I'll just point out one that we have personal interest in, the retirement planning, originally requiring that you, or disallowing a significant amount of conversations between you and your broker on what you want to do with your retirement accounts. And we're fighting that tooth and nail, because you've got to have that ability to communicate back and forth and plan for your future. So we're hopeful that we can get some of that tide of regulation changed. The manufacturing industry, again, a lot of folks just don't recognize how important that is to Montana. When I grew up, over in the western side, of course, especially, you had sawmills, and the eastern side, you had oil refineries. That was manufacturing in Montana. And those days have changed in large part, be it the sawmill side, they just aren't there anymore, literally gone. Refineries, fortunately, are doing well. I'll talk a little bit about the energy prices in a minute. But I think, there are a lot of little manufacturers out there. They're not doing business necessarily on Main Street. They're not selling their product here. They may be selling them around the world, like Tom Spica and Spica Manufacturing. But they're there, and they're contributing to the economy, and I think it's one of those things. Even the governor recognized in the Main Street Montana program the importance of the manufacturing industry, and that's why the Manufacturing Key Industry Network was formed, and we're trying to do what we can to build that industry to a greater extent. A lot of good things that can be done. At the state level, again, just quickly on the legislative side, when we met last year at this event, we were at the very start of the legislative session. We're pleased with some of the outcomes in the session. We were very happy to see some of the pollution control equipment not taxed at the level that it was in the past. One of our big bills is also what's called the Small Business Flexibility Act, requiring the legislature and agencies to look at the impact of small business when they pass or even consider regulation. We've been working on that for a long time and finally got it passed without a sunset clause on it. We worked hard to get Medicaid reform passed in Montana, and a novel approach. Just had our healthcare forum a month ago and had very good conversation on the progress that's being made and the potential for the future as well. So a good session. The greatest disappointment, I'd have to say, probably is the infrastructure funding. We've got to have infrastructure funding in this state, just for normal business operations, but also for some of the increased demands. Folks say, oh yeah, but the oil is slowed down in the Bakken. That doesn't mean that you still don't need to improve the infrastructure, not only there, but a lot of other places as well. So I've taken too much time. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and have him do his look back at 2015 from his perspective.
Okay, well, thank you, Webb, for taking too much time, because that gives me an excuse to not take very much time. Looking back on 2015, it was a really interesting year on the High Line. We went from, in 2014, having a lot of our local towns and cities trying to pass new zoning laws and everything else to keep the man camps out, to watching our cities and towns competing, trying to get the oil companies back in. So it was a really interesting year watching that development. But Tammy Christians put it best last night, saying that contrary to popular belief, Sydney is not shriveling up and dying due to oil prices. I think that's true all across the High Line. We really haven't seen the full effect of it yet, I don't think, but rentals are still full across the High Line. Housing prices have stayed steady. They're not going up like they were. But if you look back, they're not as good as it was a year or two ago, but if you look back 8 or 10 years, it's still a lot better than it was then. Along the High Line, we never really saw the big boom from the rising oil prices, so we've never really seen the bust now either. The one thing that actually is affecting our area even more so than oil prices is the Canadian dollar. Whereas in years past, the Canadians were flocking to the U.S. to shop, travel, spend their money down here because everything was cheaper, we're actually seeing the reverse now. I actually had a lot of friends who went from Cutbank to Lethbridge to do their Christmas shopping instead of Great Falls because everything's 72 cents on the dollar. You're not seeing the Canadians come down and support the retail like they were before. You know, we actually had in our business, people would come from Edmonton to buy appliances. It's an 8-hour drive, but they could actually save enough money driving down to afford driving from Edmonton. Now we still see some from Cardston, but that's a half-hour drive. You still see a few Canadians coming down from close to the border, but the ones from further up north we're really not seeing come down. Talking to both Delta and Alaska reps last night, they were saying that they're also seeing the same on flights. You're not seeing people come down to Great Falls to fly out of Great Falls because the flights are cheaper because of the exchange rate. Actually, the last flight I took, we drove to Calgary and flew out of Calgary because with the exchange rate, it was cheaper to go that way. So you're starting to see it go back to kind of how it was in 2000 when you saw people from the U.S. flocking to Canada to buy things at 50 cents on the dollar. You're starting to see a little bit of that along the High Line. As far as retail, though, it was, I think, a strong year across the board in Montana. In our business, we get to see quite a few of the industries of it between going to hardware, appliance, furniture, electronics markets, and flooring, and all of them were up. Everybody you talk to across the board around Montana says that it was a good, not a banner year, but it was at least a good year in retail. The one thing we're really starting to see is consumers are moving back to Main Street around Montana. You're starting to see them go away from the box stores and come back to the small local businesses. And I think a lot of it's actually the young consumers. They're going back to where they want to have good customer service. They don't necessarily just want to buy something on the internet. If they don't want the customer service and they don't want to support local, they will buy it on the internet rather than going to a box store. And you're starting to see more small businesses actually embracing technology to compete with the box stores. It's hard to find any retail business around anymore that doesn't have a website. If they don't, they're probably not going to be around in 2 or 3 more years. We see now, customers that 5 years ago wouldn't have had the internet, 75, 80-year-old women that will walk in and have everything printed off of what they want because they've already been shopping on your website to pick things out. And I think you're seeing that across the state, whereas Montana was a little behind the trend there. You're starting to see all of our local businesses embrace that and using the technology to their advantage to compete against the box stores. Both along the High Line and just retail in general across the state, though, I think the number one thing keeping people from growing is not being able to hire employees. There are young talent, especially on the High Line. Everybody talks about losing young talent out of the state when they leave to go to college. But when you live in Cutbank, Shelby, Conrad, Havre, and your young, talented people go to Bozeman, Missoula, Helena for college, then it's really hard to entice them to come back to the High Line. So that's the big thing we really see in our area is every employer talking about where do you get qualified help. And I think you'd see more businesses expanding in that area if they could hire the young help, especially with all the technological advances. You have to have the young qualified help, and we just can't get it on the High Line. So that's kind of where we were in 2015.
Amy?
Thanks. I'm Amy Grimalis, and I'm a lawyer by background. I work at Crowley Fleck. We're the largest law firm in the state. We have offices all over the state and in Wyoming and North Dakota. But a number of years, I migrated from litigated and now run our government affairs program over there. So I was asked to address 2 areas that I work in. One is healthcare and the other one is banking. So for those of you who know me, I always like a little interactivity in my speeches. So raise your hand if you work in healthcare. That means hospitals, insurance, any of those things. Okay, so I'm going to raise my hand because I do too. Okay, now raise your hand. Keep your hands raised, please. Now raise your hand if you work in banking. Okay, great. Now, raise your hand if either of those industries affect you. Okay, everybody should raise their hand. Okay, so the point is that I'm going to give you some stats about where we've been in banking. I'm going to give you some information on healthcare. You've heard a lot about it from Webb, from a legislative approach and what we're seeing for 2015 and 2016. But these 2 areas of the economy impact your life on a daily basis. And so you should care what is happening from a legislative stance and from Congress, which we interact with a little bit less, I would say, from the chamber's perspective. So Montana's banks, here are some numbers for you to consider. From 2014 versus 2015, the total assets in Montana rose up 6.35%. They're now over $29 billion in Montana. Total deposits exceed $23.2 billion, up 4%. Total loans are now $17.6 billion, which is an increase from last year of 7.4%. And the net income through September of 2015 was $289 million. That is up 7%. So you'll notice a trend. We have no negative numbers there. That is very good. We have a very strong Montana banking community, whether they're nationally chartered or state chartered banks. And you should all be very proud of that. Montana's banking industry has over 6,300 Montanans in it that receive checks from that institution, 61 banks, and they're located with over 500 Montana branches. We are seeing consolidation in banking, just like we are in healthcare. So that takes me to the second topic. In healthcare, we had a very robust legislative session. I'd say if you haven't heard the term Medicaid expansion, you've been hiding very well. So that term was something that moved into a bill called the HELP Act that passed, and something that the healthcare community very much supported. It, too, is one of the largest sectors in Montana for employees, whether it's in the hospital setting or insurance. Some of the issues that we'll be thinking about and talking about are the economic drivers for insurance, that collaborative approach for those new folks that didn't have insurance before and are working now and getting into the hospital setting and the clinical setting, and how that works with insurance cards that are new for some people out there. We're seeing a workforce shortage. You just heard from my colleague that it's hard to find good help. We heard from Connie Pruitt on the board last night with the Billings Clinic that they have over 100 job openings right now for RNs. And that's not going to go away. So we have a serious workforce shortage. I don't need to remind any of you that we're one of the fastest aging states out there, and we're going to need more people to take care of us. We all expect to have it, and that's going to be something we're going to be faced with as a challenge for healthcare. That goes into whether or not we expand our workforce development for those areas, whether we train more physicians, whether we have a medical school. That's been an interesting topic. So residencies, expanding those, all of that, these are topics that we'll be facing and discussing in the coming years. So I think I'll leave it at that. There's so much we could say about healthcare, and the Chamber did have a very robust discussion about that at the Healthcare Forum as well.
Good. For 2015 Natural Resource, I think we'll skip Todd. No, Todd, please.
Yeah, I think I've been placed up here to try to bring a little bit of dourness maybe to the crowd because you know the natural resource thing is not good right now in the state of Montana. But following Amy's lead, let me ask this question: how many of you watched the President's State of the Union address last night? I didn't watch it. I knew what he was going to say. I work for a coal company, and I knew there was nothing he was going to say that was going to be positive. And so rather than sit through it and then wake up angry this morning, I just read the Cliff Notes. But I will read to you, given the fact that we just heard the State of the Union last night, I have something here I'm going to read. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read key highlight excerpts from this because I think that it is going to show a difference in the way things are looked at today, and I want you to look for some of the key similarities with the rhetoric, okay? Some of you are going to be old enough to remember this at Bartlett. For the rest of you, I'll fill you in at the end. So let me start, just reading the key highlights here. Tonight, I want to have an unpleasant talk with you about a problem unprecedented in our history. With the exception of preventing war, this is the greatest challenge our country will face during our lifetimes. It is a problem we will not solve in the next few years, and it is likely to get progressively worse through the rest of this century. We must not be selfish or timid if we hope to have a decent world for our children and grandchildren. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources. By acting now, we can control our future instead of letting the future control us. Many of these proposals will be unpopular. Some will cause you to put up with inconveniences and to make sacrifices. The most important thing about these proposals is that the alternative may be a national catastrophe. Further delay can affect our strength and our power as a nation. Our decision about energy will test the character of the American people and the ability of the President and the Congress to govern. This difficult effort will be the moral equivalent of war. The oil and natural gas we rely on for 75% of our energy are running out. Our nation's independence of economic and political action is becoming increasingly constrained. Unless profound changes are made to lower oil consumption, we now believe that early in the 1980s, the world will be demanding more oil than it can produce. The world now uses about 60 million barrels of oil a day, and demand increases each year by about 5%. That means that just to stay even, we need the production of a new Texas every year, an Alaska North Slope every 9 months, or a new Saudi Arabia every 3 years. Obviously, this cannot continue. World consumption of oil is going up. If it were possible to keep it rising during the 1970s and 80s by 5% a year, as it has in the past, we could use up all of the proven reserves of oil in the entire world by the end of the next decade. Each American uses energy equivalent to 60 barrels of oil per person each year. Ours is the most wasteful nation on earth. We waste more energy than we import, and with the same standard of living, we use twice as much energy per person as do the other countries like Germany, Japan, and Sweden. Our consumption of oil would keep going up every year. Our cars will continue to be too large and inefficient. 3/4 of them would continue to carry only one person, the driver, while our public transportation continues to decline. If we wait, too few of our utilities will have switched to coal, our most abundant energy source. Our national energy plan is based on 10 fundamental principles, and I'm just going to give you a couple of them here. Number one, and you tell me if you've heard these phrases before. Some of them you will, some of you won't. The second principle, an effective conservation program will create hundreds of thousands of jobs, new jobs. The third principle is that we must protect our environment. The seventh principle is that prices should generally reflect the true replacement costs of energy. We are only cheating ourselves if we make certain energy artificially cheap. And so I'll end there. Who spoke that presentation? Ed Bartlett? Jimmy Carter, 1977. Now, I want you to think back over the number of times since 1977 that we have heard experts predict doom and gloom. The environment is collapsing. We're running out of oil. We're running out of natural gas, right? We're going to have to switch to alternative forms of energy. The climate is collapsing around us. All of these sort of predictions have been made before. Now, all I'm suggesting is that, and President Carter was probably advised by some of the smartest minds in the country, and it just goes to show what they knew. And that's kind of where we are today, is that we don't know what the future holds for us. And so, so that's a little bit of a background for this. So as a background, and let me start out with this quick stat here. Maybe it'd be easier if I stood up here real quick. Keep in mind, we're talking about natural resources. So in 2014, oil and gas revenues to the state of Montana amounted to $236 million. Coal amounted to $76 million. Now here comes the rest of that story. You all are aware of the global glut of oil, and so we're starting to see that here in the state of Montana. Oil today, and a lot of what happened in 2015 kind of escalated to where we are today, and so that's kind of where I'm prefacing this here. So oil today is bouncing around $30 a barrel, and some of these experts are predicting that we're going to see it closer to $25 a barrel. Now, that's going to have serious ramifications for the state of Montana and the revenue that the state of Montana balances its budget on. The last time we saw $30 oil was in 2002, 2003. Natural gas, we have a North American glut of natural gas. Now, this is not a global glut. The oil is a global glut. Natural gas is a North American glut of natural gas. It's brought about largely by fracking. Natural gas is running around $2.25. It's been as low as $1.90. That's abnormally low. You go into the European, Asian countries, and you're looking at $14 for the same natural gas. So there's a big divergence there. Now, what that means to the coal industry is that there's serious impacts happening to the coal industry as a result of natural gas, because natural gas is cheaper to create electricity with today than it is coal. The second and third largest coal producers in the United States are in bankruptcy today. By my estimation, somewhere between 45 and 50% of the nation's coal is either in bankruptcy or teetering on bankruptcy. So all of the coal that's produced in this country, nearly half of it is either in bankruptcy or going to be there. Fortunately, Cloud Peak Energy has got a strong balance sheet, and so we're not one of those ones. In 2015, coal production was about 900 million tons annually. Peak coal was in 2008 when we produced about 1.2 billion tons. The 900 million ton figure is the lowest coal production figure since 1986. Experts are predicting that coal is going to take another 25 to 30 million tons off of that figure for 2016. Montana is still a large coal producing state. My company was shipping coal into the Asian market. We've pulled that off. That's the tune of about $15 million impact to the state of Montana. So that's oil, gas, coal. Precious metals. Unfortunately, the precious metal and all the commodities, they're down as well. Copper, gold, palladium, those are all Montana products. Those are all down. Copper's down $2 or down below $2. That's the lowest we've seen copper prices since 2005. The last time we saw that too was in 2009, the recession. We saw a little blip there where copper fell below $2 and it's bounced up since then. Palladium is trading at about 2011 prices. So those commodities are down. Timber, Jeff alluded to the price of the Canadian dollar, or the Canadian dollar is having a devastating impact on the timber industry because we're so close to Canada. So it's cheaper now to import Canadian timber than it is to harvest it today. It's been a long issue, as Keith Olson will be able to tell you. I think Julie Altimus is here too. Access to timber on federal lands is as hard now, if not harder than it's ever been. And so not only do you have a depressed price, but you also have ability to get to the supply. And agriculture, that's the one that I think probably still remains to be seen. June saw probably peak cattle prices, and then shortly after that, the cattle price tanked. Some experts, according to one of them in Forbes, it's a cattle trader in Forbes, he's predicting that another 50% of cattle prices are going to come off in the next few months, due in large part to the fact that we had a big cattle herd expansion, and then the cattle that are headed to slaughter today are weighing 300 to 500 pounds more than they did back in the 1990s when we had our last big cattle herd expansion. So cattle are going to market, they're heavier, and there's more of them today, and so there's some predictions that the cattle market's going to go down further. So all those sort of things will affect the bottom line here in Montana. So, and then finally grains. Grains is largely a weather-dependent commodity, depending on whether or not we have, good spring rains, and depends on what happens in other countries as far as rain and weather events there. And so we'll remain to see what there. So I wish I had great news. Believe me, it's a lot more fun to work in the coal industry or the natural resource industry when things are good than when they're not good. But that's the state of the thing and how things are going to roll into 2016. I think that the state of Montana has the potential to see some real serious storm clouds on the horizon from the natural resource world as those revenues start to dry up and the revenue collectors in Helena start to realize what's actually happening.
Thanks, Todd. And again, we're trying to lay it out like it is, and recognizing that many of you are affected by these other industries, even though you may not be in them yourself. Todd had mentioned, and we certainly have later in the agenda, I hope you're going to stick around, the panel that we have at the end of the day today is going to talk about the impacts of some of those changes that are coming down the federal level and what that means to Montana. And the study that we helped produce through the Bureau of Business Economic Research, Bill Whitsitt's here somewhere, it does work with them as well. predicting, well, I think in their words, it's the biggest economic impact to the state in 3 decades. Could potentially be. It was even mentioned again in the video. The Clean Power Plan, as it's called, the 111D rule, as others refer to it as well. Stick around and be a part of that, because it could have a major impact on Montana from a variety of aspects. With that, Todd, you kind of gave a little bit on projection ahead for 2016. Any you want to add more to that?
I'm sure that was enough.
Things going to get better? Can't get worse? Yeah. Amy, do you want to follow up with a little bit looking ahead to 2016?
Well, I guess, one of the things I feel like I didn't go on and on because I knew that my colleague had a lot to share about natural resources. But I think that from a regulatory standpoint, whether it's banking or healthcare, there needs to be some sort of follow-up to those federal regulations that passed. So for PPACA and for the Dodd-Frank Act, those continue to be issues that probably need tweaking, just as every other major piece of legislation that's passed through Congress has had. And so I think we're going to continue to, from those industries, hope that there's some work to make those better. In terms of our state, we don't have a legislative session this year. We do have a lot of elections, so I'm not sure we're going to talk about elections or not, but that'll be real interesting. That might occur after tonight's event, maybe at the bar, but that's going to be a big thing. We'll have our 5 statewide officers up and 1 congressional delegate, and then, of course, all 100 House members and 25 of our senators. So
and Supreme Court.
And 3 of our 7 Supreme Court. There are 3 branches of government. So, yes, that's important to remember. I guess from a healthcare perspective, there are a lot of changes going on, but both healthcare and banking jobs are good paying jobs that drive the economy. And so I think that those will continue to be issues that we have in 2016 and 17.
All right. Jeff?
All right, well, yeah, Todd's presentation makes it kind of hard to be optimistic about a whole lot on the Highline or in the retail trade. On the Highline, I think it's going to be another interesting year in the fact that, of course, like you said, grain prices are down, cattle prices are down, farmers aren't overly optimistic, oil and gas guys aren't overly optimistic. So the one good trade-off up there is we do have a lot of tourism as well, and the low price of gas does bring in a lot more tourism to Glacier Park. So I think on the Highline, we're going to be needing to capitalize on tourism. As far as retail, I think you're going to see a lot of competition this year. For consumers, it's going to be a good thing. Prices tend to go down when the cost of raw materials are down. All the buyers go to the manufacturers and hit them for discounts when they know the price of steel, copper, transportation, everything else is down. So I think it's going to be a really competitive year in retail goods, seeing as how oil prices kind of drive prices on everything. So it'll be an interesting 2016.
Yeah, I'd just piggyback on that too on the tourism side. Glacier, as I said earlier, set the record for attendance, but next year is the centennial. So I think that combined again with the price of gas, I think we could see even another record set, and who knows, potentially Yellowstone as well. Airports, I think Terry Kramer or someone else was mentioning the record-setting levels, and of course Candace knows all about that too at the airports in Montana, which we're always screaming for more flights, right? And so I think we've got some good things going there as well. And there are some very good jobs in the tourism industry as well. A lot of spillover into other aspects also. Bill McGladdery serving on the Tourism Advisory Council for the state, they look at those issues and how Montana still has that cachet. People still want to come here. And quite frankly, a little bit maybe on the Debbie Downer side again, but the world terrorism situation has got more people looking at staying at home. And so they might come visit Montana instead of going to Israel or going to Egypt or wherever it may be. So we also look on the other side from the energy prices. I mean, that does reduce the cost for inputs, for example, in our manufacturing industry. So there's some pluses and minuses in all of these issues that we address. We do look forward to a good year again in Montana. I think, again, the American economy is recovering. Still some question about the global economy, and that will impact us. But we do have the opportunity to grow and prosper. We're working very hard to get folks to think more about exporting when they have that ability. And yes, that means Canada. Someone told us the other day, I don't do any exporting as far as I go as Canada. Well, yeah, that's exporting as well. But the manufacturing industry, I think, has a lot of potential there. I go back back to what Jeff mentioned as well, is workforce, trying to find the right worker for the job and get product or service out the door. Kathy Belter knows well about that too from the perspective of the tech industry. A lot of good things going in that arena, and I'd point to one of the highlights that's Montana is known for, which is our ability to start up businesses. We've got the highest business startup rate in the country by actually quite an amount per capita. People like business. They like to start business. They like to be in control of their own destiny. And so we're very hopeful that that will continue on into the future. Looking, the Bureau of Business Economic Research, again, will have their Winter Economic Outlook series coming up starting, I think, in a couple of weeks. I'm thinking from what they told us in this summer during our Economic Update series that, the 2.5% to 3% range is certainly achievable for us in Montana. It's not, box office business. But Tammy, again, making note, you need to compare back to 2004, 2005. Don't try to, or prior to that time even, don't try to compare right before the crash because things were just so crazy. Around the state, I think the eastern part is slowing down a bit, but maybe that's catching their breath a little bit. Billings doing well. Lots of activity that we see in Billings from a lot of arenas. The energy and the ag is certainly going to hit there, but they have got more of a diverse base, as Susan Wolf was talking about earlier. We've got the ability throughout the rest of the state. Tourism, obviously, up and down the spine of the Rocky Mountains is important and an attraction for folks. So I think that'll be a positive going forward too. Still not sure. Folks down in the Bitterroot, it was such a deep hole in the Bitterroot. It's hard to climb back out of that, and so much outside money was involved. That's probably the last place to recover in the state, but that's recovering too, and things are looking good. So we're looking forward to a great 2016. I think a lot of folks, as Amy said too, I see the loans, that are out there. That's an indication to me that people are looking at expanding and looking at getting into greater opportunities. So we're encouraged by that. We hope that it continues. We run over our time as well. I always enjoy this because we're not economists. We don't know nothing, right? But it's real life here. These are the folks that are experiencing it. It's not, on the other hand, this economist says this and that. These are the people that are experiencing it, and you know that. You're in the same boat. So I think it's more of a true picture when we hear from folks like this and from folks like you how Montana's doing. But with that in mind, I would say the state of business looks good for 2016, and I would just encourage you to keep up the good work. So let's thank our folks here for being here.